That completes Module 6, Ranges and Constructors. In this video, I'm going to provide a summary. So we learned about a new type, the range, which is a sequence of integers with start, stop, and step values. These range objects are created with the range constructor, and in fact, this is the only way to create them, and that's with the constructor. So there are three different ways to create the range objects with its constructor. If you provided a single integer, it will act as the stop value. So by default, it starts at 0. So range of 8 defines a sequence of integers from 0 up to, but not including 8, so that's 0 through 7. If you provide it with two integers, that is the start and the stop values. So this is integers 50 up to, but not including 70. If you provide it 3, then it's start, stop, and step. So this one starts at 100, steps by 10 all the way up to, but not including 200. Now when you create a range object, you do not get to see the actual integers. In order to view that sequence, you have to pass it to the list constructor like this. So this would actually list out all of those integers. And then we moved on to constructors. What is a constructor? Well, constructors in Python are used to construct, or really create, new objects of a specific type. So the range constructor creates range objects. The int constructor creates integers. The float constructor constructs floats. So I made an analogy to factories. So you can think of a constructor as a factory that produces all different kinds of objects of its type. So say we have a lawnmower factory, and it can construct many different kinds of lawnmower, many different physical lawnmowers, and that's what our Python constructors do. So we learned about all of these other constructors, which we before were just created the objects of that type, using the keyboard, not with the constructor. So for Booleans, we usually just wrote out true or false, but you can use the bool constructor and pass it in a variety of different inputs. So if you pass it in 0, an empty string, or an empty list, it just evaluates as false, so it'll return as false. This is pretty interesting. So Python, converts all of these different inputs to Boolean. So an empty string, an empty list, they get converted to false. An integer of 0 or a float of 0 gets converted to false. Anything else basically is true. So any integer, doesn't matter if it's negative or positive, as long as it's not 0. Any string, as long as it's not empty. Any list, as long as it's not empty, will evaluate as true if you pass it to the bool constructor. All right, then came the int constructor, which always creates new integers. So we passed it in a variety of inputs. So the integer, when we pass in the Boolean true, becomes 1, false becomes 0. If you pass it in a float, it will truncate it and will only return the integer part. Doesn't matter how close it is to the next integer. If you pass it in a string, it has to be just integers in that string, nothing else. So this string turned into the integer 99. The float constructor works very similarly. If you pass it a string, you have to give it a you have to make sure it's just float, so just one decimal point at most, and no other letters, and it will convert it to an actual float. Then we looked at the string constructor, which always creates new strings, and it's a little bizarre. You can pass it in true or any Boolean or false, and it'll just return it as a string with that name. Strings, when you pass in integers, just becomes a string with those same digits. Passing in a list turns that list into a string, so it'll make it look just like a list, but it'll be technically a string where the first character is open brackets and the last character is the closed brackets. Then we moved on to back into the range object. We did some properties of it. So say you want to get the length of the range, means how many integers are defined in the sequence. So say you have a complex sequence that's not easy to tell, well, you can just pass it to the len function and it will return the number, the length of that range. You can test for membership. So with the in operator or not in operator, And so here we're testing whether 155 is in the range. You will always get returned a Boolean. You can also select a specific item in the range. So here we select the item with index 10. So wherever that is located, it'll return that specific integer. All right, so that does it for the summary of Module 6.